I was the abused orphan of a ruined pack. For a cruel dare, my cousin forced me to kiss the terrifying stranger in the iron wolf mask. I thought it was an absolute death sentence, but when my trembling lips touched his, the entire glittering ballroom completely froze. He didn't push me away, and he certainly didn't kill me. He ripped off his heavy mask, revealing the legendary, glowing golden eyes of the Alpha King, the most feared tyrant in the world. Pulled me flush against his hard chest. He let out a visceral, possessive growl that shook the floor. Mine. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The Grand Masquerade of the Sunfire Court was supposed to be a safe sanctuary. Instead, it became the exact moment my fate was irrevocably sealed. My cousin Victoria handed me a crystal flute of sparkling wine. Her eyes gleamed with a familiar, cruel malice beneath her feathered mask. "I dare you, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice laced with venom. She pointed a manicured finger across the sprawling, gilded ballroom. "Kiss the man standing by the obsidian pillars. The one wearing the heavy iron wolf mask." I froze completely, the chill of the hall suddenly piercing my thin dress. She wanted me thoroughly humiliated in front of the entire kingdom's elite. Everyone knew the man standing in that shadowed alcove was inherently dangerous. He radiated an aura of pure, suffocating dominance that kept the crowd away. His shoulders were impossibly broad, wrapped in thick midnight velvet. He had stood there all evening, speaking to absolutely no one. No one in their right mind dared to approach his corner of the room. But I was a defenseless orphan of a fallen pack. I survived purely on Victoria's family's reluctant charity. In our brutal hierarchy, refusing a direct dare from a higher-ranking wolf meant severe punishment. It meant another endless week locked in the freezing, lightless cellar. I slowly set the untouched crystal glass down on a passing silver tray. My heart hammered against my ribs like a desperate, trapped bird. I nervously smoothed the skirts of my borrowed, painfully out-of-fashion silk gown. Every single step I took across the polished marble floor felt agonizing. It felt like marching steadily toward my own execution. The string quartet played a haunting waltz that matched the erratic pounding of my pulse. I could physically feel the judgment of the aristocratic guests burning into my back. Cruel whispers rippled through the gathered crowd like venomous snakes. They were all eagerly waiting for my inevitable downfall. I finally stopped mere inches from the towering, silent stranger. Up close, the heavy iron mask was intricately etched with ancient, forgotten runes. His intense gaze met mine through the jagged, narrow slits of the metal. His eyes were a vibrant, terrifying shade of molten gold. They were absolutely not human eyes. They were the calculating eyes of an apex predator. A primal chill swept instantly through my veins, freezing the blood in my chest. I knew he was an alpha, but his oppressive presence felt infinitely older. It felt far heavier than any local pack leader I had ever encountered. "Are you lost, little lamb?" his voice suddenly rumbled. It was a deep, earth-shaking vibration that resonated straight through my boots. I swallowed hard, entirely unable to find my voice to reply. I didn't think about the consequences or the sheer madness of my next move. I just acted on raw, desperate instinct to survive Victoria's wrath. I stood trembling on my tiptoes. I grabbed the thick lapels of his heavy velvet coat to steady myself. And I blindly pressed my lips directly against his. The entire glittering ballroom instantly plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. Even the musicians stopped playing abruptly, leaving a final note hanging awkwardly in the air. His lips were surprisingly warm, yet uncompromisingly firm and unyielding. For a fraction of a second, the massive stranger went completely rigid against me. Then, a low, terrifying growl ripped directly from the depths of his chest. It wasn't a growl of anger or offense as I had feared. It was a visceral sound of absolute, primal possession. His massive hand suddenly clamped around my waist like an inescapable vice. He effortlessly lifted me an inch off the floor, pulling me flush against his hard chest. The sheer power of his grip sent a violent jolt of electricity straight to my core. My breath hitched as my inner wolf howled in sudden, undeniable recognition. He forcefully broke the kiss but strictly refused to let me step back. He buried his masked face deeply into the sensitive crook of my neck. He inhaled deeply, forcefully taking in the unique scent of my skin. "Mine," he snarled. The single, booming word echoed like thunder through the totally silent hall. His golden eyes flared with a lethal, burning light that promised pure destruction to anyone who objected. Shocked, trembling gasps finally erupted from the paralyzed crowd. I heard Victoria drop her glass. It shattered loudly against the marble floor. I finally inhaled his scent and realized exactly who I was holding on to. The sharp scent of crushed pine, violent winter storms, and fresh blood flooded my senses. I instantly recognized the legendary golden eyes of the supreme predator. This man was not just some dangerous, anonymous stranger from a neighboring territory. This was Gideon, the Alpha King of the Untamed North. The ruthless, undefeated conqueror who had slaughtered his way to the high throne. He was universally known for leaving no survivors and taking no prisoners. And I had just publicly kissed him. His rough thumb traced my trembling jawline with agonizing slowness. It was a silent, terrifying threat and a binding, unbreakable promise all at once. "You started this dangerous game, little mate," he whispered darkly against my ear. "But I am the only one who finishes it." He turned his imposing frame toward the terrified, staring crowd. He held me impossibly tight against his side, fiercely shielding me from their eyes. "She leaves with me tonight." He didn't ask the host for permission. He issued an absolute royal command. Not a single alpha in the room dared to breathe, let alone raise an objection. I was utterly terrified of the ruthless monster holding me captive. Yet, as he carried me effortlessly out into the biting cold night, something shifted within my soul. Wrapped in the overwhelming heat of his thick cloak, I felt something entirely foreign. I actually felt completely safe. I belonged to the most feared monster on the continent now. And somehow, I knew the monster would never let anyone hurt me ever again. The heavy wooden door of the royal carriage slammed shut behind us. The sudden noise echoed like a final judgment in the freezing night air. I was instantly enveloped in complete, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the pale moon slicing through the frosted glass windows. I sat completely frozen on the plush velvet cushions. I was far too terrified to even draw a proper breath. Gideon took the wide seat directly across from me. His massive, imposing frame seemed to consume every single inch of available space. The sheer radiating heat of his large body was physically overwhelming in the cold cab. He slowly reached up and unclasped the heavy iron wolf mask. The sharp metallic click sounded louder than a gunshot in the silent carriage. He tossed the priceless, ancient artifact onto the seat beside him without even looking. The shifting moonlight finally revealed the true face of the Alpha King. He was devastatingly handsome, yet completely terrifying all at once. Sharp, aristocratic cheekbones carved harsh shadows across his rugged skin. A single, thin silver scar cut sharply through his thick left eyebrow. It was a brutal, permanent reminder of exactly how he had earned his bloody throne. His molten gold eyes remained fixed on my face with unnatural, predatory intensity. I reflexively shrank back against the hard wooden wall of the carriage. I fully expected him to demand immediate submission or brutally punish my earlier audacity. Instead, he let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded almost like profound relief. He leaned forward, resting his heavy, muscular forearms on his thick thighs. "You are shaking, Eleanor," he murmured, his deep voice surprisingly soft. The low rumble of my name on his lips sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. How did the supreme, undisputed ruler of the North know my forgotten name? I was a nobody, a discarded, abused orphan from a ruined lineage. Before I could even voice my question, he moved with terrifying, blinding speed. In a single heartbeat, he crossed the small carriage and knelt directly before me. The most feared predator on the entire continent was willingly kneeling at my feet. He reached out and gently captured my trembling, cold hands in his large ones. His palms were heavily calloused, rough from years of endless, brutal warfare. Yet, his touch was impossibly light, as if he believed I were made of fragile glass. A sudden rush of searing, magical warmth flooded rapidly through my cold fingers. The residual terror from Victoria's cruel dare began to instantly melt away. "Look at me," he commanded softly into the quiet space. It was not a polite request, but a gentle, inescapable demand. I forced my reluctant gaze up to meet those piercing, golden predatory eyes. "I have scoured the bloody ashes of 100 ruined packs," he said slowly. "I have violently interrogated every surviving elder in the treacherous outer territories. I have sent my absolute best trackers into the darkest, most dangerous forests. I have spent 10 long, agonizing years looking for you." My heart practically stopped beating inside my chest. "Looking for me?" I choked out, my voice barely a broken, pathetic whisper. "That is absolutely impossible, my king. I am just a weak, omega-blooded orphan serving the High Council. I have swept filthy floors and scrubbed cold cellars for my entire miserable life." A low, incredibly dangerous growl vibrated in the tight space between us. "Do not ever call yourself that again," he warned, his eyes flashing with lethal fire. "Your blood is older and far purer than any wretched noble at that pathetic masquerade. You are the last surviving heir of the sacred Lunar Crest lineage. They hid you away and broke your spirit to maliciously suppress your true scent." He reached up and gently brushed a stray, tangled lock of hair behind my ear. His rough knuckles lightly grazed the sensitive, pulsing skin of my neck. When your lips touched mine, the ancient soul bond finally snapped into place. It was not just a mere, biological scent recognition, my beautiful little mate. It was the sudden awakening of a blood pact that predates the first kings. My mind spun wildly, completely unable to process the absolute magnitude of his words. I was not a lowly servant, and I was certainly not a weak, disposable omega. I was his fated equal, born by the gods to rule beside the monster of the North. Suddenly, a loud chorus of vicious, frantic howls erupted from outside the carriage. The heavy vehicle rocked violently as several large wolves surrounded us on the frozen road. I instantly recognized the distinct, highly aggressive hunting cries of Victoria's personal guards. They had recklessly followed us, likely hoping to drag me back to the dungeon by my hair. Old, conditioned fear instinctively gripped my throat, instantly paralyzing my vocal cords. I knew exactly what Victoria's cruel guards did to disobedient, runaway servants. Gideon did not even bother to turn his head toward the frosted glass windows. His glowing golden eyes remained entirely, exclusively focused on my terrified face. He slowly stood up to his full, incredibly intimidating height inside the carriage. The air around us grew completely dense, suddenly heavy with suffocating, lethal intent. He simply raised one large, powerful hand toward the reinforced wooden door. A massive shockwave of pure, dominant alpha aura blasted outward from his body. It was a physical, crushing force that violently rattled the heavy iron carriage frame. The aggressive, snarling howls outside were instantly cut off mid-breath. They were immediately replaced by pathetic, high-pitched whimpers of absolute, terrified submission. I heard the distinct, heavy sound of large bodies hitting the frozen dirt in complete surrender. He had completely neutralized an entire elite guard squad without even raising his voice. He had brought the most arrogant, vicious warriors to their knees with a single thought. He slowly turned back to me, his expression ruthlessly cold and completely resolved. No one from your painful, abusive past will ever lay a hand on you again, he vowed quietly. Anyone who even tries will be immediately fed to the starving winter wolves. You belong to the sovereign, untouchable territory of the North now, Eleanor. You belong entirely, body and soul, exclusively to me. He sat down heavily on the cushions beside me, completely closing the distance between us. He wrapped his massive, velvet-clad arm securely around my trembling shoulders. He firmly pulled my head down to rest against his solid, fiercely beating chest. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, powerful, and comforting rhythm of his wild heart. The carriage surged forward rapidly into the dark, snowy, and completely unknown wilderness. I was completely at the mercy of a legendary, bloodthirsty tyrant. But for the very first time in my miserable, lonely life, I felt genuinely invincible. I knew deep in my soul that this beautiful monster would gladly tear the world apart for me. The relentless journey to the heart of the frozen north took 3 days. I spent the entire time wrapped securely in Gideon's impossibly warm embrace. The landscape outside our frosted windows slowly transformed into a brutal wonderland. Towering mountains of jagged ice and ancient pine forests dominated the horizon. We finally arrived at the legendary Winterforge Castle just as the sun set. The fortress was a terrifying masterpiece of dark stone carved directly into the mountain. Massive iron gates groaned loudly as they slowly swung open to admit our carriage. The sprawling courtyard was completely filled with the most hardened warriors I had ever seen. They were all massive, covered in brutal battle scars, and practically radiating raw violence. My heart plummeted into my stomach as I felt hundreds of predatory eyes lock onto our carriage. I instinctively tried to pull Gideon's thick velvet cloak tighter around my fragile shoulders. I was acutely aware that I smelled like the weak, conquered territories of the South. Gideon instantly sensed my rising panic and gently caught my trembling hands. "Do not hide your face, Eleanor," he murmured firmly, his golden eyes glowing in the dim light. "You are not a prisoner being delivered to the execution block. You are the undisputed queen returning to her rightful throne." He kicked the heavy carriage door open effortlessly with one booted foot. The biting, freezing wind of the high mountains instantly whipped through my hair. Before I could even attempt to step down, Gideon lifted me entirely into his arms. He carried me out into the unforgiving cold as if I weighed absolutely nothing. A profound, heavy silence immediately fell over the massive gathered army. It was not a silence of respect, but a tense, suffocating quiet born of deep confusion and doubt. A towering man stepped forward from the front ranks of the gathered soldiers. He was thickly muscled, missing his left eye, and carried a massive broadsword on his back. This was General Vane, the ruthless commander of Gideon's vanguard. "My king," Vane rumbled, his deep voice carrying clearly over the howling wind. "You return victorious from the weak lands, but you bring an unexpected burden. The North does not shelter fragile, southern pets who cannot survive our winters." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the tightly packed ranks of hardened soldiers. The sheer hostility directed at me was thick enough to physically choke on. I buried my face against Gideon's chest, terrified of the massive general's wrath. I fully expected the king to explain himself or perhaps order me to walk on my own. Instead, the temperature in the courtyard suddenly dropped by another 10 degrees. Gideon did not shout, nor did he draw the massive blade resting at his hip. He simply released a concentrated, lethal wave of his absolute alpha dominance. It hit the entire courtyard like a physical, devastating avalanche of invisible force. Every single warrior, including the massive General Vane, was instantly forced to their knees. The thick stone paving cracked audibly beneath the sheer weight of his oppressive power. You dare to question my judgment, Vane? Gideon's voice was deathly quiet and incredibly dangerous. You dare to speak to your queen with such vile, unforgivable disrespect? General Vane gasped for air, his face pale as he struggled against the crushing pressure. She smells of the weak southern servant classes, my king, Vane choked out stubbornly. Gideon let out a sound that was half laugh, half predatory snarl. Your primitive nose betrays your complete ignorance, General. You are blind to the ancient magic that runs through her veins. Gideon shifted his hold on me, turning me slightly so the kneeling army could see my face. Her name is Eleanor, the last surviving heir of the sacred Lunar Crest bloodline. A collective, shocked gasp swept violently through the kneeling ranks of soldiers. The Lunar Crest was a mythical lineage, revered as the original founders of the wolf societies. They were believed to be completely extinct for over a century. She is the true mother of our kind, and she belongs entirely to me, Gideon declared loudly. Her scent was masked by years of cruel abuse by the pathetic cowards in the south. But she is here now, and she will rule this frozen wasteland by my side. He stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching loudly against the frost-covered stone. He walked straight past the trembling general without granting him a second glance. He carried me effortlessly up the steep, imposing steps leading into the grand hall. The interior of Winterforge Castle was vast, illuminated by roaring fires in massive hearths. At the very end of the cavernous room sat the legendary throne of the North. It was carved entirely from a single, massive block of dark, unyielding ice. It looked incredibly cold, completely unforgiving, and deeply lonely. Gideon did not set me down to let me stand respectfully beside it. He sat down directly on the massive icy throne and settled me firmly onto his lap. He wrapped his arms around my waist, anchoring me permanently to him. The heavy wooden doors of the hall slammed open as the highest-ranking nobles rushed inside. They scrambled over each other to fall to their knees before the dais. Look closely at the woman sitting upon my lap, Gideon commanded the terrified room. Her word is absolute law in this castle, equal only to my own. If she commands you to walk into the freezing sea, you will gladly drown. If she sheds a single tear because of your actions, I will personally eradicate your entire bloodline. Do you understand me? A chorus of frantic, completely submissive agreements echoed loudly off the high stone walls. I sat frozen on the lap of the most dangerous man alive, staring down at the kneeling elite. No one had ever looked at me with anything but pure disgust and open disdain before today. Now, the most fearsome warriors on the continent were trembling violently at my feet. I slowly looked up into Gideon's impossibly handsome, battle-scarred face. He was looking down at me with an expression of such raw, absolute devotion that it stole my breath. He was giving me the entire world on a silver platter, soaked in the blood of his enemies. The terrified orphan who had scrubbed floors just 3 days ago was truly dead. In her place, protected by the King of the North, a new queen was finally taking her first breath. The heavy oak doors of the king's private chambers clicked shut, sealing us away from the terrified court. The massive stone room was incredibly warm, heated by a roaring fire that smelled of sweet cedar and crackling pine. I stood frozen in the center of the luxurious carpet, suddenly overwhelmed by the absolute, deafening silence. A few short hours ago, I was a despised, nameless servant wearing a borrowed, ragged silk dress. Now, I was standing in the undisputed stronghold of the brutal North as its fully recognized, reigning queen. The sheer, crushing weight of this impossible reality suddenly crashed heavily onto my fragile shoulders. My knees trembled violently as a wave of deep, exhausting self-doubt washed completely over me. How could a broken, abused orphan possibly rule alongside a legendary, undefeated warrior who commanded entire armies? Gideon moved silently across the room, gracefully stripping away his heavy, intricately embroidered velvet cloak. He casually tossed the thick fur garment onto a massive, velvet-draped four-poster bed that dominated the large space. Without the heavy, imposing layers of royal armor, he looked even more powerfully built and incredibly lethal. Thick, corded muscles rippled across his broad back, covered in a beautiful, terrifying tapestry of silver battle scars. Yet, as he turned slowly to face me, the terrifying aura of the bloodthirsty tyrant completely vanished. His glowing golden eyes softened remarkably, filled with an ancient, deeply consuming hunger that stole my breath. He closed the considerable distance between us in just 3 long, smooth, predatory strides. He gently cupped my pale, trembling face in both of his massive, calloused, battle-scarred hands. His rough thumb stroked my delicate cheekbones with a profound reverence usually reserved for sacred idols. "You are overthinking everything again, my beautiful little mate," he murmured softly into the quiet, firelit room. "I can easily hear your racing heartbeat echoing loudly in this chamber like a frantic, trapped drum." I nervously lowered my gaze, feeling entirely unable to meet the overwhelming, burning intensity in his eyes. "I do not know how to be a queen, Gideon," I finally confessed, my voice breaking pathetically in the silence. "I have only ever known how to survive in the dark, dirty cellars of the cruel South. I am absolutely terrified that I will inevitably fail you, humiliate myself, and ruin this entire kingdom." A low, deeply soothing rumble vibrated slowly within his broad, incredibly muscular chest. He firmly tilted my chin up with one finger, gently forcing me to look directly into his unwavering, golden gaze. "You do not ever need to learn how to be anything other than exactly who you already are. Your pure lunar crest blood inherently holds the ancient, forgotten memories of the very first rulers. Ruling is not a learned, practiced skill, Eleanor, it is a primal instinct permanently woven into your very soul." He leaned down slowly and pressed his surprisingly warm, firm lips gently against my forehead. The gentle, unexpected contact instantly sent a violent cascade of delicious, electric sparks straight down my spine. He moved his mouth deliberately slowly, tracing a fiery, agonizingly gentle path down the sensitive curve of my jaw. "When I finally found you tonight, my dormant, exhausted soul immediately recognized its long-lost missing half. I have been wandering endlessly in complete, suffocating darkness for my entire, miserable existence. You are the only radiant light that has ever managed to successfully pierce my eternal, freezing winter." His raw, completely unfiltered confession thoroughly shattered the last remaining defensive walls around my battered heart. This fearsome, unstoppable monster was willingly and completely laying his entire soul bare at my small feet. I slowly reached up, my trembling fingers hesitantly tangling into the thick, dark hair at the sensitive nape of his neck. He let out a sharp, ragged groan, instantly and powerfully responding to my extremely tentative touch. His massive arms wrapped securely around my tiny waist, effortlessly lifting me flush against his rock-hard body. He captured my lips in a deep, devastatingly passionate kiss that tasted intoxicatingly of dark wine and absolute possession. There was absolutely no hesitation left between us, only the desperate, consuming need of 2 fated souls finally colliding. I melted completely into his overwhelming embrace, eagerly returning his fierce, demanding, and breathless kisses. For the very first time in my entire, miserable life, I felt truly, unconditionally cherished, protected, and deeply desired. We fell back heavily onto the soft, luxurious furs of his massive bed, completely and hopelessly lost in each other. The profound bond between us flared brilliantly to life, loudly singing a powerful, forgotten song of ancient, primal magic. Suddenly, a strange, remarkably profound heat began to radiate rapidly from the very center of my beating chest. I gasped sharply, pulling back slightly as an entirely unfamiliar, rushing sensation rapidly flooded my veins. A soft, ethereal, and impossibly beautiful silver light began to physically glow from the surface of my pale skin. The dim room was instantly and completely illuminated by the haunting, unmistakable radiance of a full moon. Gideon froze instantly in his tracks, hovering directly over me with his massive muscles pulled absolutely taut. The tender, deeply consuming desire in his golden eyes was rapidly replaced by a sudden, incredibly grave realization. He gently touched my glowing, silver shoulder, his strong jaw clenching tightly with intense, barely concealed worry. "The physical awakening of your ancient lunar crest lineage has officially begun," he whispered darkly into the glowing room. "Your raw, unmatched power is finally breaking through the cruel, suppressing seals placed upon you as a defenseless child." He quickly pulled me tightly against his broad chest, shielding my glowing body completely with his massive, dark frame. "But this brilliant, undeniable silver light will unfortunately act as a massive beacon to the ancient, lurking shadows. The forgotten, monstrous enemies who cowardly slaughtered your ancestors will know exactly where you are hiding now." He pressed a fierce, incredibly desperate kiss directly into my glowing, silver-streaked hair. "Let them finally come for us," the Alpha King snarled, his deep voice vibrating with absolute, terrifying, murderous intent. "I will gladly drown this entire cursed continent in their blood before I let them touch a single hair on your head." The brilliant silver light radiating from my skin slowly faded back into the quiet shadows of the royal bedchamber. But the devastating consequences of my sudden, ancient awakening were already beginning to unfold across the frozen north. Before the sun could even attempt to break over the jagged, ice-covered mountains, the massive warning horns of Winterforge Castle blared. It was a terrifying, deeply bone-chilling sound that violently rattled the heavy stained glass windows of our private sanctum. Gideon stood by the massive iron balcony, his broad, violently scarred back completely rigid with absolute, murderous fury. He had already strapped on his heavy, midnight black battle armor, looking every inch the legendary, undisputed Alpha King. "The corrupted shadow packs have aggressively breached the outer western borders," he snarled, his deep voice vibrating with pure violence. "They were instantly drawn by the immense, unmistakable magical surge of your sacred lunar crest awakening." He crossed the large room in two massive strides and pulled me fiercely against his cold, ironclad chest. His golden, predatory eyes burned with a chaotic, agonizing mixture of supreme rage and absolute, terrifying devotion. "I must personally ride out and slaughter every single one of those pathetic monsters before they can advance any further. I absolutely hate leaving you here, my beautiful queen, even for a single, miserable second." I reached up with trembling fingers and gently traced the sharp, familiar scar running through his dark eyebrow. The terrified, abused orphan from the weak south would have completely collapsed in tears and desperately begged him to stay. But the newly awakened, ancient magic burning intensely in my veins demanded complete, unwavering royal strength. "Go and completely eradicate them, my king," I commanded softly, my voice surprisingly steady and deeply resonant. "I will securely hold your massive fortress until you return covered in the blood of your defeated enemies." He crushed his mouth violently against mine in a searing, bruising kiss that tasted heavily of desperate promises and dark war. Then he was gone, leaving the massive, echoing stone chamber feeling incredibly empty and dangerously cold. I did not have long to sit and quietly mourn the temporary absence of my fierce, undisputed protector. Less than an hour after Gideon's massive army rode out, my heavy bedroom doors were unceremoniously pushed open. A tall, striking older woman strode confidently into my private sanctuary without even bothering to request an audience. She wore the elaborate, dark crimson robes of the high priestess, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, unforgiving braid. Her name was Lady Rowena, the highly revered and deeply feared spiritual leader of the entire Northern Territory. She looked down her long, aristocratic nose at me with an expression of undisguised, absolute aristocratic disgust. "The king may be entirely blinded by your sudden, convenient magical display, you little southern rat," she hissed venomously. "But I am absolutely not fooled by whatever cheap, parlor trick you used to mimic the sacred ancient light." She stepped dangerously close to me, her dark, deeply sunken eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated malice. You are nothing but a weak, pathetic distraction who has foolishly lured total destruction straight to our sacred borders. While the Alpha King is distracted, I will personally see you thrown into the deepest, freezing abyss of the mountain. 2 massive, heavily armored temple guards stepped aggressively into the room, drawing their viciously hooked blades. A terrifying, freezing panic instinctively tried to claw its way up my tight throat, begging me to cower and surrender. But the burning, silver heat resting deep inside my chest suddenly flared to brilliant, uncontrollable life. I did not slowly back away from the arrogant, threatening high priestess and her pathetic, armed executioners. Instead, I completely straightened my spine, tapping directly into the absolute, limitless well of my ancient, royal bloodline. I slowly raised my right hand, my palm glowing with a blinding, completely undeniable white-hot silver radiance. The thick, suffocating magical pressure I released into the room was fundamentally different from Gideon's brutal, physical dominance. It was a pure, crushing, divine authority that instantly forced the very air to completely crystallize and shatter around us. You dare to aggressively enter my private sanctuary and threaten the true mother of your kind? I asked, my voice echoing with unnatural power. The 2 heavily armored guards immediately dropped their heavy weapons, violently falling to their armored knees in absolute, overwhelming terror. They physically could not withstand the suffocating, divine weight of the pure lunar crest energy radiating from my small body. Lady Rowena gasped sharply for breath, her arrogant, cruel face instantly draining of all its previous, haughty color. She aggressively tried to fight against the crushing, invisible pressure, stubbornly refusing to bow to a weak southern girl. Kneel before your undisputed queen, I commanded, my glowing silver eyes burning straight through her wicked, treacherous soul. The absolute command was backed by the heavy, undeniable weight of 10,000 ancient, legendary wolf ancestors. Rowena's knees violently buckled under the immense, magical strain, crashing heavily onto the cold stone floor. She stared up at me in absolute, undeniable horror, completely realizing that she had foolishly challenged a true, living goddess. I am not a weak, disposable pet waiting quietly for her powerful master to return, I stated coldly, looking down at her trembling form. I am the absolute, unquestionable ruler of this fortress, and my authority is completely absolute. The freezing winds howled violently outside the thick glass, as if celebrating my newly established dominance. I slowly lowered my glowing hand, allowing the blinding silver light to completely retreat back beneath my pale skin. The heavy, suffocating magical pressure instantly vanished from the large bedroom, leaving the air painfully thin and incredibly cold. The 2 terrified guards remained completely pressed against the stone floor, absolutely refusing to look up at my face. Lady Rowena remained frozen on her knees, her entire body shaking uncontrollably beneath her dark crimson religious robes. Her previous arrogance had been entirely completely erased, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing religious terror. She finally understood that the ancient legends of the Lunar Crest were absolutely not just mythical bedtime stories. You will immediately return to your grand temple and properly prepare your followers for the upcoming, bloody war, I ordered firmly. If you ever dare to question my absolute authority again, I will personally strip you of your sacred title. Do you completely understand your precise, unwavering instructions, High Priestess? Rowena slowly bowed her head until her silver braid practically touched the cold, unforgiving stone of the floor. Yes, my absolute queen, she whispered brokenly, her voice completely devoid of its previous, hateful venom. I watched in complete, silent satisfaction as the 3 broken intruders desperately scrambled out of my royal chambers. For the very first time in my entire existence, I had successfully defended myself without needing anyone else's protection. I slowly walked over to the massive iron balcony and stared out at the dark, unforgiving, and deeply frozen wilderness. Somewhere out there in the freezing darkness, my legendary mate was violently tearing our absolute enemies apart. He would undoubtedly return to find that his fragile, Southern bride had completely transformed into a true, undeniable ruler. I was finally ready to stand proudly beside him and jointly drown this entire treacherous continent in fire and blood. The agonizing wait for the Alpha King's return felt like a cruel lifetime of pure torture. I paced relentlessly across the massive, echoing stone floor of the grand hall. The brilliant moonlight cast long, haunting shadows through the narrow, frosted upper windows. Every single ferocious howl of the winter wind outside sounded exactly like a dying wolf. I tightly clutched the thick, emerald fabric of my gown, silently praying to the forgotten gods. I had thoroughly crushed High Priestess Rowena's treacherous rebellion merely hours ago. I had successfully established my absolute, unquestionable authority over the entire terrified fortress. But none of that newfound royal power mattered if my fated mate did not return alive. Just before the stroke of midnight, the heavy oak doors of the great hall finally crashed open. The freezing, unforgiving winter wind howled violently into the silent, deeply expectant castle. General Vane and four other massive, blood-soaked warriors stumbled clumsily into the grand entryway. They were desperately supporting the towering, heavily armored form of the supreme predator. Gideon's magnificent, midnight black battle armor was completely shattered across his broad chest. Thick, unnatural black blood dripped steadily onto the pristine, polished marble floor. I sprinted down the grand staircase, utterly ignoring strict royal protocol and my heavy skirts. My anxious heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm relentlessly against my delicate ribs. What happened to him? I demanded, my voice ringing with an absolute, undeniable authority. General Vane refused to meet my eyes, his deeply scarred face pale with genuine, uncharacteristic terror. The corrupted shadow leader used a forbidden, ancient curse, my queen, the veteran warrior rasped. The king ferociously slaughtered the beast, but the vile dark magic has severely infected his bloodstream. Our finest, most experienced healers cannot stop the rapidly spreading, lethal corruption. Gideon let out a low, ragged growl, violently pushing his fiercely loyal generals away. He stumbled blindly forward, his massive, usually unstoppable frame swaying dangerously in the dim light. He collapsed heavily to his knees right at the bottom of the cold marble stairs. I immediately dropped to the floor beside him, frantically catching his incredibly broad shoulders. His skin, which usually radiated an intoxicating heat, was terrifyingly cold and unsettlingly clammy. Thick, toxic black veins pulsed visibly beneath his pale skin, aggressively crawling up his thick neck. His radiant golden eyes flickered erratically, heavily clouded by blinding pain and lethal dark magic. Eleanor, he choked out weakly, coughing up a terrifying splatter of dark, corrupted blood. I solemnly promised you. I would return to you. A sudden, agonizing sob tore directly from my tight throat, temporarily shattering my carefully maintained composure. This invincible, legendary monster was literally dying right in front of my terrified eyes. The horrific realization instantly severed the final, lingering threads of doubt within my anxious mind. I was absolutely not going to let the cruel universe unfairly take my fated mate away from me. I pressed both of my trembling hands directly over the shattered ruin of his chest armor. I squeezed my eyes shut and ruthlessly commanded my ancient, sacred blood to answer my desperate call. The familiar, blinding silver light instantly erupted from my palms with an unprecedented, ferocious intensity. It did not just gently glow, it roared violently into existence like a dying, desperate star. The brilliant lunar crest magic flooded forcefully into Gideon's ruined, heavily corrupted body. I could physically feel the vile, freezing dark magic aggressively fighting back against my pure light. It was an agonizing, invisible war being waged entirely within the Alpha King's dying veins. The surrounding generals backed away in absolute shock as the divine silver radiance engulfed us both. The horrific corruption felt like thousands of icy needles violently piercing my own unprotected mind. It desperately tried to push me away, aggressively feeding on his immense, fading life force. But my profound love for this violent, devoted ruler was infinitely stronger than any ancient curse. I poured every single ounce of my soul, my raw emotion, and my ancient lineage into the magical connection. "You do not have my permission to die, Gideon," I whispered fiercely into the blinding, swirling light. "You solemnly promised to burn this entire, wretched world down to keep me perfectly safe. You absolutely cannot leave me to rule this unforgiving, frozen wasteland entirely alone." My absolute, undeniable command surged powerfully through the sacred magical bond tying our souls together. The terrifying black veins on his neck began to visibly recede, desperately fleeing from my cleansing magic. The unnatural, freezing cold radiating from his massive body was slowly replaced by his familiar, comforting heat. The intense healing process was incredibly draining, rapidly pulling the vital energy straight from my fragile bones. My vision blurred violently with exhaustion, but I stubbornly refused to break the desperate, life-saving connection. I relentlessly pushed the absolute limits of my newly awakened power, completely refusing to accept defeat. After what felt like a truly painful eternity, the dark corruption finally shattered completely. A massive shockwave of pure, cleansing silver energy blasted outward, instantly knocking the hardened generals back. Gideon took a sudden, massive, and agonizingly deep breath, his broad, muscular chest heaving violently. The brilliant silver light slowly faded from my exhausted hands, leaving the hall bathed in dim torchlight. I slumped forward, entirely drained of all physical strength, and landed softly against his rapidly repairing chest. His large, heavily calloused hands instantly came up to wrap securely around my small, trembling frame. He buried his face deeply into my silver-streaked hair, inhaling frantically and exhaling a long, shuddering breath. "You saved my miserable life, my beautiful, impossible queen," he murmured directly against my sensitive ear. His deep, resonant voice was rough with pure emotion, stripped completely bare of his usual, ruthless arrogance. "I am entirely yours, completely and eternally bound in blood, in magic, and in life." I held onto his massive shoulders with everything I had left, finally understanding the true, unfathomable depth of our bond. We were absolutely no longer just a ruthless, bloodthirsty king and his surprisingly powerful, rescued queen. We were equal, undeniably vital halves of a legendary, unbreakable soul, completely invincible together. General Vane slowly approached us, completely dropping to his heavily armored knees and bowing his head to the floor. The other hardened, veteran warriors immediately followed suit, offering their absolute, unquestioning loyalty directly to me. They had personally witnessed the undeniable, miraculous return of the sacred lunar crest magic. But much more importantly, they saw that the invincible king of the north was kept alive solely by his chosen mate. I rested my tired head against Gideon's rapidly beating heart, feeling completely and utterly victorious. The terrifying, looming shadows of the ancient enemies were still lurking dangerously outside our fortified walls. But as Gideon slowly lifted me effortlessly into his strong, protective arms, I knew we were finally ready for them. We would bravely face the coming, inevitable darkness together, completely united in profound love and ancient magic. The horrific darkness that nearly consumed the Alpha King was now entirely gone. Gideon stood completely still before the massive, roaring hearth in our private chambers. His heavily scarred chest rose and fell with an undeniable, incredibly powerful renewed vitality. The legendary power of my pure lunar crest blood had completely cleansed his deeply tainted veins. But the terrifying, lingering threat of the ancient shadow pacts still loomed heavily over the frozen north. He slowly turned to face me, his glowing golden eyes burning with absolute, lethal resolve. "We can no longer patiently wait behind these thick stone walls for them to strike us again," he declared deeply. "I will gather the entire vanguard and march aggressively into the treacherous western valleys at dawn. We will completely eradicate their corrupted bloodline before the next full moon ever rises." He crossed the luxurious carpet in 3 long strides and gently pulled me against his radiating, powerful heat. But before I leave to bathe this freezing continent in their wretched blood, there is something we must do. The sacred, ancient bond between us is undeniably real, but it is not yet physically complete. He slowly reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently tracing the incredibly sensitive curve of my pale neck. I strictly need to leave my absolute, permanent physical mark upon your fragile skin, Eleanor. I need the entire wretched universe to know that your eternal soul belongs exclusively to me. My breath hitched violently in my tight throat at his incredibly intense, primal demand. I was absolutely no longer the terrified, abused orphan desperately begging for tiny scraps of mercy. I was a fully awakened, undeniably powerful queen, and I desired this magnificent monster with every single fiber of my being. I tilted my head back completely, willingly, and entirely exposing the most vulnerable part of my throat to his lethal jaws. "Do it," I whispered fiercely, my voice trembling with profound, overwhelming, and absolute anticipation. A deep, terrifying, and incredibly possessive growl ripped violently from the very bottom of his broad chest. His sharp, elongated fangs gently grazed my fast-pulsing artery, sending violent shocks of pure electricity straight through my veins. Then, he finally bit down hard, aggressively claiming me with a desperate, agonizingly beautiful precision. A searing, brilliant wave of pure, undeniable fire instantly exploded deeply within my very core. The profound, sharp pain lasted only a mere fraction of a second before completely transforming into absolute, transcendent ecstasy. I could suddenly and perfectly feel every single powerful beat of his wild, untamed heart as if it were my own. His raw, overwhelming emotions, his fierce love, his profound terror of losing me, his absolute devotion, violently flooded my unprotected mind. We were finally, irreversibly forged together into a single, completely indestructible entity. He slowly withdrew his sharp fangs, his molten gold eyes blazing with an unprecedented, highly triumphant possessiveness. He gently and reverently kissed the bleeding, permanent mark he had just violently etched into my pale skin. "You are finally, truly, and eternally mine," he murmured, his deep voice incredibly thick with absolute reverence. "Now, you must remain safely hidden within this impregnable fortress while I slaughter our ancient enemies." I slowly stepped out of his wonderfully warm embrace, my spine completely rigid with newfound, ancient, and divine power. "No," I stated firmly, the single, unyielding word echoing loudly in the completely silent, fire-lit bedchamber. Gideon physically froze in place, his handsome, deeply scarred face instantly darkening with profound, instinctive royal rejection. The brutal battlefield is a place of pure, unimaginable slaughter and endless horrors, my sweet queen. I absolutely and categorically refuse to risk your precious, entirely irreplaceable life among those vile, bloodthirsty monsters. I did not back down even an inch, boldly meeting his terrifying, alpha stare directly with my own glowing, divine silver eyes. They did not violently attack our secure borders merely to challenge your northern, frozen throne, Gideon. They aggressively marched out of the dark, forgotten shadows specifically and exclusively to hunt me down. I am the very last living, breathing vessel of the sacred lunar crest magic that absolutely terrifies their corrupted, dark souls. I slowly raised my right hand, allowing the blinding, divine silver light to flare brightly and intensely around my trembling fingers. Your massive steel swords and brutal, unmatched physical strength can easily cut through their corrupted, rotting flesh. But only my ancient, sacred, and intensely burning fire can permanently incinerate their twisted, lethal dark magic. I took a deliberate, highly confident step closer to my heavily armored, profoundly terrified, and legendary king. We are equally and permanently bound in this brutal life now, entirely sharing one ancient soul and one bloody destiny. If you boldly ride out to face absolute death in those freezing, deadly valleys, I am riding directly and unapologetically beside you. Gideon stared heavily down at me in absolute, profoundly stunned silence for several long, deeply tense moments. He finally and completely realized that I was absolutely not asking for his royal, protective permission. A slow, incredibly proud, and wildly dangerous smile slowly spread across his rugged, battle-scarred face. He firmly grasped my glowing, silver-lit hand and pressed a deeply respectful, intensely loving kiss to my knuckles. Then we will gladly and brutally burn this entire treacherous world down to ash together, my beautiful, unstoppable queen. The treacherous western valleys were entirely shrouded in an unnatural, suffocating darkness. Jagged obsidian peaks pierced the bleeding crimson sky like the broken teeth of a dead god. I rode proudly beside Gideon on a massive, heavily armored northern warhorse. The heavy iron armor plating clanked loudly against the howling, freezing mountain winds. Thousands of elite northern warriors marched resolutely behind us in absolute, deadly silence. They were no longer just following their ruthless, undefeated Alpha King into another bloody war. They were marching fiercely to protect their newly awakened, divine queen. The thick, vile stench of rotting flesh and ancient corruption suddenly hit my sensitive nose. A deafening, horrific chorus of twisted howls erupted simultaneously from the surrounding black cliffs. The corrupted shadow packs poured down the steep mountainsides like a devastating avalanche of pure nightmare. Their bodies were grotesquely mutated, oozing thick black magic from their terrifying, unnatural wounds. Gideon drew his massive broadsword, his golden eyes igniting with absolute, apocalyptic fury. "Leave absolutely no survivors," the Alpha King roared, his deep voice violently shaking the frozen earth. He charged directly into the absolute center of the monstrous horde without a single second of hesitation. He was a magnificent, unstoppable god of war, effortlessly cleaving through the corrupted beasts. Dark, toxic blood sprayed violently into the freezing air as the northern vanguard violently clashed with the enemy. But the corrupted leader, a massive, twisted monstrosity, had anticipated our aggressive, frontal assault. The frozen ground suddenly trembled as a massive, glowing black circle violently erupted beneath the battlefield. It was a devastating, ancient blood array, designed specifically to brutally drain the life force of pure wolves. Thick, thorny vines of solid dark magic violently erupted from the frozen, cracked earth. They aggressively wrapped around the legs of the northern warriors, violently dragging them down into the freezing mud. Even Gideon was temporarily forced to his knees as 5 massive shadow wolves aggressively pinned his heavy broadsword. The twisted enemy leader let out a victorious, deeply disturbing, and highly unnatural laugh. He arrogantly believed that the undisputed king of the north had finally been entirely defeated. He fundamentally underestimated the absolute, ancient power of the woman riding quietly beside the king. I gracefully slipped down from the tall saddle, my boots landing softly onto the blood-soaked, freezing ground. I did not feel even a single ounce of fear as I calmly walked directly into the center of the horrific slaughter. The violent, swirling dark magic aggressively lashed out at me, desperately trying to pierce my fragile skin. It violently shattered into a million harmless pieces the exact moment it touched my pure, invisible aura. I slowly raised both of my bare hands toward the violently bleeding, crimson sky. I completely stopped, desperately holding back the immense, ancient ocean of magic resting deep inside my chest. "I absolutely deny your wretched existence on my sovereign land," I commanded, my voice echoing with divine authority. I fully triggered the legendary, long-forgotten state known strictly as the lunar flare. A blinding, utterly devastating pillar of pure, white-hot silver fire violently erupted directly from my soul. It shot rapidly up into the dark, heavy clouds, instantly shattering the suffocating darkness completely covering the valley. The overwhelming, divine shockwave of solid moonlight violently blasted outward in a massive, perfect circle. It did not simply push the horrific dark magic away, it instantly and violently incinerated it into absolute nothingness. The terrifying, ancient blood array painted on the ground violently shattered like cheap, fragile glass. The grotesque, mutated shadow wolves instantly screamed in absolute, inescapable agony as the silver light violently consumed them. The terrifying enemy leader desperately tried to flee back into the dark, comforting shadows of the steep mountains. But my absolute, divine light aggressively hunted him down with extreme, terrifying, and completely unavoidable prejudice. He was violently reduced to a pile of smoking, grey ash before he could even take 3 desperate steps. The entire, massive valley was instantly plunged into a stunning, completely breathless, and deeply absolute silence. The terrifying, supposedly invincible Shadow Army had been entirely wiped out in less than a single minute. I stood completely alone in the center of the scorched, smoking battlefield, heavily gasping for cold air. The immense, physical toll of unleashing the ultimate lunar flare violently crashed down upon my fragile bones. My vision suddenly tilted violently as my exhausted, trembling knees finally gave out beneath me. I did not hit the cold, unforgiving, and deeply scarred ground. Gideon was instantly there, his massive, blood-soaked arms wrapping fiercely and protectively around my trembling waist. He pulled me aggressively against his heavily beating heart, completely uncaring of his own brutal battlefield injuries. "I have you," he murmured fiercely into my tangled, silver-streaked hair, his voice rough with pure, overwhelming awe. The surviving northern generals and fierce warriors slowly climbed to their exhausted, trembling feet. They did not loudly cheer for their absolute, undeniable, and truly miraculous victory. Instead, they simultaneously slammed their heavy, bloody fists directly against their armored chests. They dropped to a single knee in the freezing mud, offering me their absolute, eternal, and deeply religious devotion. I had completely destroyed the ancient darkness, firmly securing my absolute place as their eternal, undisputed ruler. We returned to the massive gates of Winterforge Castle as absolute conquerors. The brutal winter wind finally seemed to bow respectfully to our triumphant arrival. The sprawling courtyard was completely filled with thousands of northern citizens. They no longer looked at me with the cruel, biting suspicion I had faced before. Instead, they stared up at the royal balcony with profound, unquestioning reverence. Gideon stood tall beside me, radiating the quiet, immense strength of an undisputed ruler. He was finally washed clean of the dark, toxic blood from our vanquished enemies. He wore the magnificent, deeply embroidered midnight velvet of his royal station. His scarred, battle-hardened hand enveloped mine in a remarkably gentle yet unbreakable grip. Today was not merely a grand celebration of our ultimate battlefield victory. It was my official, undeniable coronation as the true Queen of the North. A profound, heavy silence fell over the vast courtyard as Gideon raised his hand. He turned slowly to me, his golden eyes brimming with a deeply vulnerable devotion. He did not summon the heavy, traditional jeweled crown worn by the forgotten queens. Instead, he retrieved a flawless band of pure, dark metal from his coat pocket. This ring was not forged by ordinary, mortal blacksmiths, his deep voice resonated clearly. It was crafted from a fallen star and permanently tempered in my own blood. It is utterly indestructible, much like the sacred soul you so graciously share with me. My heart swelled with an overwhelming, deeply resonant rush of pure emotion. The most feared predator alive was willingly laying his entire existence at my feet. He slowly slid the heavy, warm metal onto my trembling left ring finger. A gentle, comforting pulse of silver magic flared beautifully between our joined hands. "I, Gideon, willingly bind my eternal soul to yours," he vowed into the quiet winter air. "I promise to fiercely protect your heart and follow your divine light until the end of time." He pressed a ferociously tender, lingering kiss to the back of my hand. A deafening, triumphant roar instantly erupted from the gathered army below us. They were fiercely celebrating the glorious dawn of a completely new, magical era. I looked down at the beautiful, dark ring resting perfectly on my pale skin. I thought of the terrified orphan who used to shiver in the dark, damp cellars. That broken, abused girl was entirely gone, forever replaced by a woman who commanded the stars. I leaned up and pressed my lips affectionately against Gideon's rugged, scarred jaw. His powerful arms immediately wrapped around my waist, anchoring me securely to his side. "I am eternally yours, my fierce king," I whispered softly against his warm skin. He captured my lips in a breathtaking, passionate kiss that promised a lifetime of profound peace. The terrifying shadows that once constantly threatened to consume me were completely vanquished. I had finally found my permanent, unshakable sanctuary in the arms of my greatest protector. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never have to be afraid ever again.